I'm realizing like, oh my gosh, I've blamed my dad for all the wrong, but my world is so filled with abundance and opportunity and love. And I have to blame him because his absence created fire and fuel inside of me. And his mistakes taught me lessons that I won't ever duplicate. And now I have 2 kids, 8 and 6 years old, and I will never be the father that my dad wasn't. His absence grew me to be a way better dad than I ever knew possible.
Do you ever feel that your positivity or your energy might overpower some that are down or challenged?
I'll tell you this. I think pessimists hate me. That you're gonna find your tribe, and whatever you throw out, like everything in this world is contagious. Whatever you throw out there is going to come back to you. You attract what you are, and I don't want to be surrounded by a bunch of negative a-holes. I don't want to be surrounded by Debbie Downers. Victims are some of the most exhausting people in my life. To have bad things happen is inevitable for us all, but to live on that pity pot is a really dangerous spot, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, your first words out of your mouth where you're talking about how your mom passed and your dad wasn't really in the picture. And I was going to ask you the first question of what's the hard stuff? Like what's very challenging that you've been through? And I think before I even asked, you answered something, but I'll let's go back to that and just see what comes out. What is something that comes up when I ask you, Eric, what's the hardest thing that you've had to endure or overcome?
Boy, therapy has shown me a lot. I jumped back into therapy. It had been like 15 years of avoiding therapy, and things have felt pretty good. But I've had a really exhausting last 7 months, and I've lost hundreds of thousands of dollars with one of my businesses. I've had a whole bunch of people that I poured into just up and leave and give the old double gun salute on their way out. Not intentionally, so not out of crass intent, but I've felt completely chopped down. And therapy has opened up a lot of things for me, and it all comes back to daddy issues. I think most people have mom or dad issues, and I was raised in a single parent home with one foot in the welfare bucket most of my life growing up. And then when I was 16, my mom got diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and I was really her caretaker along with some of my family members for 5 years. It changed the course of my life for forever. And that was the one impact that changed my life the most. But everything in my life is seen through the lens of not being wanted or desired by my own father. And so that has the pain of rejection has hurt far more than the pain of loss. And so rejection for me, in any way, shape, or form is amplified because of that daddy issue. And my dad passed away now 11 or 12 years ago. And the great news is, Matt, is I was able to find forgiveness. Literally 6 months before my dad died, I was in the ministry and I had just transitioned out. I spent about 8 years doing youth ministry at a church, and then another couple of years doing some side gig things. So about 10 years into the ministry, I had one of my youth group kids, his name's Graham, came to me and he's like, Eric, my dad's about to die. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And I knew that he had this really broken relationship with his father, just absolutely crushed him. And Graham and I went out and I was connected with him. And I'm like, Graham, dude, I know you have this anger and animosity and hate and this venom flowing through you towards your father. If he's going to be gone soon, I'm afraid if you don't find forgiveness that you're going to continue to wear that weight. And so can you pray your way through it? Can you find your way through it? Because forgiveness, when you are angry at someone, it's like drinking poison and expecting them to die. It's impossible. The forgiveness that we have is this trap for us. And so I encourage him, Graham, you got to forgive your dad. Can you find a way? And he's like, hey, Hatch, you first. And I'm like, oh, screw you, Graham. No, we're not talking about me here. We're talking about you. I'm pretty good at giving advice. I don't need to take any advice, right? I was so quick and easy and ready to be like, Graham, you know what, dude, that's that's for you, but that's not for me. And so I went home and I prayed and I wrestled and I talked with my wife and we processed all this. And I'm like, am I ready to forgive my dad for all the mistakes that he made, for everything else? And there's this episode. If you haven't done so, go to Netflix, run to Netflix when this is done, and check out Tony Robbins's I'm Not Your Guru. Have you seen it, Matt? Okay, so Tony has it's literally at about the 17-minute mark. This young gal gets up, and she says to Tony, "Hey, I'm dealing with these issues with food and my weight." And she's like a 21-year-old gal, and he just keeps on asking questions like Tony Robbins does. And in that, it turns out that he says, "All right, when you were younger, whose love did you crave more, your mom or your dad?" And she's like, well, my dad, but my dad chose drugs like my dad did. And my dad chose this life of addiction and he was filled with hatred and all these things. And he's like, have you blamed your dad for things? She's like, oh, absolutely. I blame him for like all these things in my life, all these compounded pieces. And Tony says in that moment, he says, if you're going to blame him for all the things that have gone wrong, you also have to blame him for the things that are great in your world. You have to learn to blame gracefully and intentionally. And I hadn't seen it at that time, but Tony gave such a better voice to it than I ever could. And so in that moment, Matt, I'm realizing like, oh my gosh, I've blamed my dad for all the wrong, but my world is so filled with abundance and opportunity and love. And I have to blame him because his absence created fire and fuel inside of me. And his mistakes taught me lessons that I won't ever duplicate. And now I have two kids, 8 and 6 years old, and I will never be the father that my dad wasn't. His absence grew me to be a way better dad than I ever knew possible. And so all these things I learned to blame gracefully. And so through that, I found forgiveness because I looked at my dad and I was able to maturate with this amount of empathy for the first time. I went from apathy to sympathy. I started to feel sorry for his plight instead of just not caring about him. But then I'm like, man, what would it have been like? Like, did my dad consciously say, I want to hurt my son? And those weren't ever his choices. He was a slave to addiction and he didn't have the strength and he didn't have the surroundings and he didn't believe in himself well enough. And he gave me the gift of believing in myself when I saw that he didn't believe in himself, right? And so I found this forgiveness 6 months before he died. I sent him a letter. I apologized for my sins and shortcomings. I asked him for forgiveness of me. He almost immediately reached out afterwards, spelled my name wrong, which is just a bizarre, weird dad thing that I have with him, right? Like that's how not connected to my life that he was. I'm Eric with a K and he spelled it Eric with a C. But he died 6 months later. And I've had nothing but peace in my life. I still have emptiness and things I'm trying to piece together now because so many things in my world are accelerated and disastrous in some sorts of ways because of that absence. But that ability to forgive was such a gift that I gave myself and I was able to give to him before he lost his life.